You're listening to the DCAU Review, hosted by Cal and Liam. Streaming on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and at DCAUreview.com. Now, here's today's episode.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 124 of the DCAU Review. I'm Cal, as always, and with me is my good brother, good friend, it's Liam. Liam, we are in week 3 of our Green Lantern month here at the DCAU Review, and we decided, as we mentioned on last week's episode, to take a trip to the Elseworlds with an exciting new series this week, one that probably doesn't get as much love as it may deserve, and I'm excited to chat with you about it this week.
Yeah, there's a lot of unique things to get into with this show. That show, of course, being Green Lantern, the animated series, which started back in 2011. And I think the people who have watched the show from start to finish love it. And unfortunately, maybe due to the promotion or lack thereof by Cartoon Network at the time, there just weren't a lot of people who watched it. And there's some fun stuff, and it also happens to be our first CGI computer animated edition of a show. This is the first time we've watched a show in something besides traditional 2D animation. So a lot of unique stuff here in week 3 of our Green Lantern month.
Well, I will correct you on that because I said that last week, and that is incorrect as well. We did cover an episode of Beware the Batman Batman Elseworlds month last year, which is also CGI.
But it made such an impression on us.
Clearly, yes. That also is kind of one of those weird Cartoon Network shows that was only around for one season, didn't get much love, and kind of exists on the fringes of fandom because there wasn't a huge, didn't quite allow it to build up the following that a lot of the other shows, even the outside of the DCAU, the Teen Titans, or Justice League Action only had one season as well. But some of those other series that lasted for multiple seasons that have built up fandom, Young Justice. Some of those other shows that had more than one season sort of to showcase and build up a fan base. So now, as you mentioned, we are going to be covering the premiere episode of Green Lantern, the animated series, which debuted back on November the 11th, 2011. That's right, 11/11/11. I don't know if you remember where you were. I have no idea where I was 11/11/11. But this is there was a sneak peek of this series, Liam. And I guess before we get into the official synopsis of this week's episode, which is titled Beware My Power, which premiered as a 44-minute, hour-long presentation on the Cartoon Network. It was kind of a sneak preview before the series actually debuted in 2012. I guess we can briefly just chat about sort of the background of how this cartoon came to be. Of course, this was right around the time. This was supposed to be sort of launched by the popularity of the summer blockbuster smash hit that was supposed to be the Green Lantern movie. And you don't have to be a comic book fan to know that never quite happened.
Yes, for a whole myriad of reasons, but I think the number one being the movie wasn't good. That's generally going to hurt any tie-in products. I think we spoke about it back when we reviewed Legion of Superheroes earlier this year, but that was sort of meant to tie in with Superman Returns, and not directly, obviously, but in the sense that let's capitalize off the popularity of Superman with his new movie and now this new cartoon, and then the movie didn't make any money and people didn't like it, so the cartoon was somewhat short-lived as well. That being said, it's very unique within the world of DC animated projects. Obviously, the only other one, as you mentioned, to compare it to is Beware the Batman, which was a Glenn Murakami helmed project along with Butch Lukic. However, this one, we do in fact have the godfather, so to speak, of the DCAU. Bruce Timm was the head producer and showrunner on this series, and it is interesting, and we'll certainly get into that as we get into our main categories, Cal. But it's really interesting to see like the specific well-known Bruce Timm style in 3D form.
Yeah, it's definitely, and we'll definitely cover that when we get into the way that this show looks in our visual and animation category. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the guys look the same. They have the same. It's very obvious Bruce Timm design work influence there, and there are some other people, of course, that were involved in this project. This first episode, which we'll find out, of course, in a second when we go through the synopsis, was directed by Sam Liu, who's obviously worked with Bruce Timm a lot and has done a lot of the direction on probably any of your favorite direct-to-video DC movies. He's done a lot of directing with those, and so he's got fingerprints on this. There's a lot of well-known people that you're going to know as we kind of go through here and talk about whether it's directors or executive producers or voice actors. So there's a lot of this that feels familiar, and for that, I think that if you haven't given this a chance, I can tell you that I had seen maybe three or four episodes of this at some point during the original run, and I could not tell you what those episodes were. I don't think that it was this premiere episode, but I was excited, and it's a shame that it not only was the movie a bust and sort of devalued the character, I think, in the eyes of the DC executives at the time, but another reason that happened is because the movie sucked. So many of the tie-ins, the toys, the marketing opportunities that were tied in with Green Lantern at that time, which obviously is something that entices showrunners and companies to pour money into cartoon projects. There's so many of these Green Lantern figures clogging the shelves for years. I mean, years at Toys R Us. I'm almost certain, like I'm not even exaggerating, 2 years ago or whatever it was when Toys R Us went out of business, they still had Green Lantern movie figures on the shelves. Like they stuck around that long. They did not sell at all. So that was something else. Marketing opportunities were going to be limited if they did continue with this show. And again, that's something that I think a lot of those companies look at when they're looking whether or not they should pour money into it, especially you have to imagine with it being CGI, it was probably a little bit more expensive than your standard animation. So who knows? But it's a shame ultimately that this didn't get the love that it did, didn't get a chance to kind of breathe. However, you can check it out, at least for now, on the DC Universe streaming app if you're here in the US. If not, I'm sure there are ways for you to locate the series itself out there. I know it's been released on DVD also, so you can check it out. I say give it a chance. I think, like Liam said, those that have seen it and have been able to watch it all the way through have really enjoyed it. So let's get into it, Liam. Let us break this down. Start, as we always do, with our IMDb official synopsis for this week's episode.
That's right, and because this is technically a two-parter, I do get to read two synopses again this week. So Green Lantern Month really just the gift that keeps on giving here.
But yes, run is over.
But yes, these are the synopses for Beware My Power Parts 1 and 2, which were written by Jim Krieg and Ernie Altbacker, directed by Sam Liu and Rick Morales, with music for both parts by Frederick Weidman. And those synopses read as such. Two Green Lanterns, Hal Jordan and Kilowog, make an unsanctioned mission to the borders of the universe to investigate another Green Lantern's death. And for part 2, Jordan and Kilowog make a rest stop at the homeworld of fellow Green Lantern Shier Rev. But the Red Lanterns return and a battle erupts.
Alrighty. Those break it down pretty well. I think those are pretty close to the actual descriptions of the episodes. I take no fault with those. So yeah, let's get into the storytelling here a little bit, Liam. So as far as the plot is concerned here, we are much like we were with Beware the Batman, like we were with a lot of the heroes from Justice League, the animated series, or even Justice League Unlimited. This is not an origin tale for this Green Lantern. We are sort of dropped in, and I wasn't quite certain whether or not this is an origin tale at first, because you're introduced to Hal Jordan first. Hal Jordan, the pilot. There's some alien Green Lanterns that are shown beforehand, but really not sure whether or not this is going to be a Hal Jordan origin story, especially based on the fact that it deals with some of the similar elements that the Green Lantern movie did, in that pilot, him being a pilot, and he's piloting this expensive aircraft, and he's interacting with Carol Ferris, who eventually may or may not become Star Sapphire. It is in the comics. So a lot of those elements from the movie, which was an origin story, kind of remain the same. But I was pleasantly surprised that this is, they kind of drop you in expecting you to know who he is.
Yeah, I think they give you enough if this is your first exposure to the character. They set up when we meet him, as you mentioned, he is flying this experimental military aircraft and is sort of being read the riot act by Carol over how he needs to be careful because it's this expensive prototype, and it's sort of, and we see very quickly that he does have the ring. There's an earthquake, and he has to spring into action. And while he does save a train from derailing, he unfortunately allows the jet to crash right into the side of a cliff. So it is not a smooth start for him, but we sort of get a little bit of a tease of romance with him and Carol before he is called away on this mysterious mission to Oa. And that's sort of where we get our call to action from there. But I do agree that it was for the best to not bog this down with the traditional Hal Jordan origin story, especially because, again, if they were making this in mind that it would sort of tie into the movie did his origin. So whether they did it well or not is probably another conversation. But I think they figured there's enough awareness of who Green Lantern is, and even if you don't, you can kind of figure it out pretty quickly.
Yeah, I guess the best case that I should have used, one that I left out, was Batman the Animated Series, that also did not do a Bruce Wayne origin story. I mean, eventually they sort of did, you can argue that with Mask of the Phantasm, but you don't get Bruce's parents getting shot in the first episode of Batman the Animated Series. You're kind of dropped there based on the fact that you kind of already know who Batman is, which I think in a lot of ways that helps, because you're not bogged down with having to use up so much of your precious time with a story that the majority, even if your show is geared towards children, how many children actually care about how your hero becomes the hero? I think it's interesting, at least with Superman as sort of the outlier and Static Shock, if you want to get technical, both of those guys have in the DCAU have a animated origin story told there, but the rest of the heroes you really don't get an origin story from, and I think it's okay.
Yeah, no, I think that's fine, because as you mentioned, if you're an adult watching this show, you probably already know, and if you're a kid watching it, you probably don't care. So I think skipping kind of right to the crux of the episode, explaining what the conflict is and sort of getting right into it is a better option. And again, I mean, if this had gone more seasons and you wanted to at some point go back and do an episode that's the origin episode, or like you said, even a movie like Mask of the Phantasm that touches on sort of his earlier career, I think that would have been fine. But yeah, as it stands here, I am all for getting right to it.
Yeah, I think sprinkling it in and having it as a backup in later episodes, if you want to sprinkle it in, you do get elements of Bruce's origin story throughout Batman the Animated Series, of course, or you touch on some of the backstory of your characters in Justice League a little bit, but you don't have to necessarily go with a straight up, this is the hero before he was a hero, and here's who he is now. So I will say, so going forward with this, there were some interesting moratoriums placed on this animated series also because the movie was happening at the same time, and one of them, they were in production at the same time. One of them was they were asked not to use Sinestro, There were plans ultimately, of course, if you've seen the Green Lantern movie, first of all, I'm sorry. Second of all, you know that there were, if you stayed around long enough to watch the whole movie, there was a post-credit scene that involved Sinestro, and he was prominently featured he was probably the only enjoyable thing in that movie. But Sinestro was set up to be the villain in the sequel, so there was apparently a moratorium on them, like we have heard about some of the moratoriums placed on the producers of Justice League Unlimited, not being able to use Batman characters, and in later seasons of Justice League Unlimited, Liam. So with this, the creators decided to sort of dip into the Green Lantern mythos that was sort of being written at that time, or had just recently been written in the Blackest Night storyline, and branched out and started using the Red Lanterns.
Yeah, I think that was a really interesting idea. Obviously, it's weird to not have the greatest Green Lantern villain available to you, but I think sort of like we talked about with Beware the Batman, again, I guess there's a lot of parallels when they sort of chose to really not feature the A-list villains and try to flesh out some of the more recent ones like Professor Pig, and here we see Atrocitus and the Red Lantern Corps, who had just been introduced in the books maybe at the most maybe 2 years prior, and they are good. They set them up as, I think, good dangerous threats to the Green Lantern Corps. They're sort of like really right near the start of the episode, we see this sort of young Green Lantern in sort of this Outer Rim area that we find out later on is kind of barely paid attention to by the Guardians. They send rings out, and they have Green Lantern Corps, but they don't even really train them. They just kind of send the rings out and leave it alone for the most part. We see a Green Lantern murdered by these two Red Lanterns, Razor and Zilius Socks. And of course, later on in part 2, we meet their leader, Atrocitus, who, as we mentioned, is sort of in the books is also the leader of the Red Lantern Corps. So, but yeah, they set them up as just truly vengeful, evil guys, and we don't get a lot of exposition about that. There's a lot of allusions by Atrocitus in part 2 to getting his revenge on the Guardians, or talking about what the Guardians did to them, but they sort of decided to keep that mostly shrouded in mystery, at least for the first 2 episodes, and just sort of focus on them being these angry, vengeful people who, once they realize that there are even more Green Lanterns in the system, they basically threaten to blow up the home of this Green Lantern that Hal and Kilowog meet, that being Sheer Riv, and that's sort of where we get our call to action in part 2. But yeah, I think they do a pretty good job of, especially because there hadn't been, and I guess even now still hasn't been, that many Red Lantern stories told. So taking characters that were still pretty new and immediately setting them up as your big time, top bad guy, that takes some guts, but I think they do a pretty good job of establishing that threat.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think the only thing that it is funny because we finished up talking about how there didn't need to be an origin story. I think the only thing about the plot that I was missing, and especially for these characters that are relatively new to the lore, and I guess maybe the assumption is people don't care, but I think one of the most fascinating things to me is where the Lanterns draw their power from, and that's something that was really, really worked out in that Blackest Night storyline where these Red Lanterns were introduced. And to me, I think recognizing that these characters, and again, we watched 1 episode or 2 episodes made into 1 episode, so this could very well be explained later on, and I'm sure it is, based on the fact that I think there are other Lanterns that eventually get introduced to this series. But it would have been interesting to at least discuss why in the episode it seems that the Red Lanterns are so much more powerful than the Green Lanterns. It seems like they have little to no problem sort of handling the Lanterns in battle. A couple of times that could be explained away as having like a 2-on-1 advantage, but it's at one point it's 3-on-2 or 2-on-2 for both sets of lanterns when Hal and Kilowog go to rescue this lantern that was under attack, and they're kind of running away with their tails tucked between their legs until Hal sort of supercharges his ring. So I think the only thing that I could have used a slight little more backstory on is, and we got a lot of filler, Atrocitus's motivation for why he doesn't like the lanterns, but where this sort of in the comics, it's the rage, it's the anger, it's the hatred that really fuels the Red Lantern's rings, and sort of seems to be more powerful than the Green Lantern's willpower that sort of powers their rings. So I think a better explanation, or at least a little more hinting at that, the characters are just sort of evil. They're not angry. They don't seem to be angry. They just seem to be bad.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that is something that's captured, I think, very well in the comics, is that most of the Red Lanterns, other than maybe Atrocitus, are these sort of just like angry, violent. They literally, like, they all vomit up this like red acidic bile as when they get their rings on their finger, and it's sort of just this just violent. They're more like wild animals than they are soldiers or ring bearers in the sense of the Green Lantern would be. So yeah, I do think that's fair. They are for the most part, they are, as you said, generically evil, but not exactly the most I don't know. They don't quite capture, I think, the ferocity. I think you see that a little bit more on display in the scenes with Atrocitus fighting Hal in part 2. But yeah, they don't quite capture it. It's more, especially the Zilius Sox, the round Red Lantern, is mostly just like an evil guy.
He's like MODOK. Like, that's exactly who he looks like MODOK, and he acts like MODOK from the old Iron Man cartoon from the mid 90s, if you recall. Very just like, he's an evil sidekick. Like, this is what his job is, and he's going to throw this other character, Razor, under the who is they set up in this episode. He's a newish recruit to the Red Lantern Corps, and he seems to at least have somewhat of a conscience. And they keep hinting that maybe he's not as dedicated, or has some conflict in killing innocent people, or having innocent blood on his hand versus just straight up killing the Green Lanterns. So that's something that's established, and it will absolutely play out throughout the rest of the series as he ends up getting captured at the end of the episode by Kilowog and Hal. So you did mention, so we do get to see Oa a little bit. We get to see the Guardians, who, by the way, I know they sort of set up Ganthet as like the good version of the good Guardian, and that's traditionally he's been the more relatable Guardian in DC Comics lore. But why are the Guardians always like the evil? They're like the evil government. Did you ever notice that? It's like,
well, I think it's like some kind of, I think that's meant to be some commentary on like bureaucracy, or like a lack of, they care more about following procedure than they do seeing that true justice is done. I think that's kind of the implication there, is that they're just so by the book, and they have to follow. They have this rigid set of rules and laws that all Green Lanterns must follow, and sometimes that gets in the way of them actually doing their jobs, or doing their jobs the way that the individual lanterns think they should, at least.
So the spirit of the law versus, they're more letter of the law versus like the spirit of the law and working outside. And of course, it's set up also in this episode as he's put on trial initially, and then eventually attempted to be put on trial a second time. Hal is the natural foil and rebel to the by the books leadership of the Green Lantern Corps, which I guess is sort of a trope that follows any sort of police show that there has ever been. Is there's, you know, the titular hero is typically the guy who doesn't play by the rules and doesn't follow the leaders, and the leaders always have to rein him in and try and shaking their fist at him every time that he does something outside the. So I guess if the Green Lantern Corps is the international police or the intergalactic police, then I guess that would make sense. That just sort of procedurally follows that, with them being the bad guy, or the sort of the overlords that you just kind of want to. Why won't they just let Hal be Hal? You know.
Yeah, I guess it gives him a natural foil who isn't a complete evil entity, but is still sort of there to put some extra roadblocks along the way for our heroes, certainly.
All right. So as we go through, Liam, the rest of the episode is Hal decides that he's going to go outside what the Guardians have expressly told him to do. He's going to steal this Green Lantern spaceship. I guess this was just an excuse to introduce one of the only female characters that they decided to introduce in this first episode, and that being the Aya, who is the artificial intelligence that runs this spaceship that I guess will be Green Lantern's vehicle throughout this episode. Seems like it was just designed to be a toy that they could sell later on. Which, again, from time to time, that will happen. But so he steals this spaceship, goes to try and save the Green Lantern, going against the ruling of the Guardians, and there's conflict. He meets the Red Lanterns. They blow up the planet of this other Green Lantern that they went to save, which was sad. Like, I really didn't see that coming. There's a lot of death in this episode. There's multiple Green Lanterns murdered, and a whole planet just, although the people are saved, but the whole planet is just destroyed.
Yeah, it's interesting to start your series out on like kind of a downer note, where not only did the bad guys mostly get away, they also succeed in what they were trying to do, which was they said if the planet didn't voluntarily turn over the Green Lanterns to them, that they'd blow it up. And what do you know? They blow it up. And yes, Shair Rev, who is this sort of, as we said, the sort of outer rim, far out, I think they call it frontier galaxy, where there are Green Lanterns out there, but they don't have much training and they're kind of left to their own devices. But he's sort of this not super well trained guy, but he's very brave, and he has his wife and child who we meet. And yes, while his wife and child are survived, Kilowog is able to save his family and most of the other people. Rev himself gives his life in order to give everyone else enough time to get away. And it's really quite a somber note to end on. They do capture, as you mentioned, the sort of rookie character called Razor. That's sort of the one consolation prize as we come to the end of our part 2 there. But yeah, it's a pretty downer ending, and there's even sort of some talking during the episode before the final battle where Rev and Kilowog are discussing it, and we find out that Kilowog's entire planet was destroyed, all of his people are dead, and he's the sole survivor of his world. And that's sort of where the crux of it is. When it's clear that they can't stop the bomb from going off, Rev asks Kilowog, what would you do if you had one more chance to save your people? And Kilowog tells Hal at the end of the episode that, I realized what I would do was save the rest of the people, which sort of leads to, it's not conflict, I wouldn't say, but it sort of leads to Hal having some doubts about his decision to kind of chase the bad guys, while Kilowog was able to get most. They do qualify it as most of the people off the world, but it is implied that there was at least some folks who didn't make it, as well as this young Green Lantern who also dies. And they're sort of asking, what happened? Did he make it out? And then you just see his ring floating off to go find its new host. So yeah, it's quite a kind of a downer ending, and we do sort of set up now. That's sort of, I guess, the heroes have a reason to seek revenge on these Red Lanterns now, and maybe get the Guardians more directly involved with it. But yeah, that's that's quite an interesting call to end your first episode, which, as we mentioned, aired as this TV movie for the first time, or this TV special where both parts aired back to back, to end it on kind of that downer note. It was a bold strategy. I'll give him that.
Yeah, it actually reminded me of, I would say it's safe to say that Star Wars DNA is sort of felt throughout this whole 44 minutes or so. There's several things that plot-wise seem like very Star Wars-ish. There were several shots that we'll talk about in visuals in just a moment. Several different shots and character voices and positions and scene setups that were very Star Wars-like. But that to me is that similar feeling to the end of the first Star Wars film. Episode 4, A New Hope, you do get some victory. Like, there are some people that save, there is some bright spot to it, but don't forget, Princess Leia's whole planet was blown into smithereens and billions of people were killed. Like, so it's not like they got off scot-free. It's not like that. It's not a complete downer, kind of like how Empire Strikes Back is, but it's still like, hey, this is still something they're going to have to deal with. It's not complete victory. There's a motivation for your characters to continue this battle against this Red Lantern Corps and to find out more about them. And they now have personal motivation because they met this guy Shia Rev and befriended him and met his family and met his daughter, who's a young girl who basically they transport these people to a new planet and they have to sit there with her as she realizes that her dad is gone. So yeah, there's some of that that's like, it's a downer and it's bad. Yeah. It's not a straight up feel good way to end it. But I feel like that was also a good way to, like, hey, we debuted this in November, and I don't think that the series actually premiered to either March or April, I think. So it was a couple months after this that it eventually debuted. So you have some time where you're like, hey, this is going to be really fun to go through and see how the rest of this story plays out. Don't, come back and see us. Like, this is a good little cliffhanger to leave you on the end there to draw you back in. So it is a risk, but I appreciate it because I think it sets up a motivation for the rest of the series going forward.
Yeah, I think it's a fair way to look at it, and I guess we can get into our plot scores from here. Like I said, I think it's a good first chapter or first two chapters, depending on how you want to look at it. I do feel part 1, I think it drags a little bit until we finally get Cal and Kilowog onto the ship and they're going to investigate. There's like the first 10 or 12 minutes I feel like could have moved along a little bit quicker. But that's sort of minor nitpicky things. Overall, I think it's a good solid not an origin story, a pilot for the series. And for those reasons, I gave it a solid 7 out of 10.
Nice. I am right there. I gave it just a tick higher. I gave an 8 out of 10. I think it's funny. There's actually a part where the Guardians are sort of explaining something to Hal and Kilowog and Green Lantern Salak, I believe, as they sort of enter the hall where the Guardians are sort of holed up and they're about to put him on trial, and Hal mentions that basically that they're delivering some exposition, that it's like, oh, well, you guys are talking a lot or something like that. He makes it sort of backhand as if to acknowledge that this part is very exposition heavy. So yeah, without it being an origin story, I think that it could have been worse, but I don't think that your critiques are off base with the first part dragging. I feel like, though, that they kind of made up for it for the rest of the episode. A lot of heavy action that takes place in the rest of the episode. So that's why I ended up giving 8 out of 10.
Fair enough.
All right, Liam, let's move on to visual and animation. And we already mentioned a little bit. Again, this is CGI. It's not your standard animation. We did mention it has Bruce Timm's fingerprints on it because he was the executive producer on this show. So the characters it's like, how do you translate a 2D drawing style into 3D? To me, I think it rings true. It feels familiar, but at the same time, it definitely has its own flourish to it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, just the way the characters are drawn or built. It's still, the men are all big, broad chest, mostly broad chested and sort of smaller, skinnier legs, and Hal Jordan looks like a very like archetypal Bruce Timm superhero design. But yeah, there's definitely some interesting flourishes here, and obviously this Kilowog design is quite a bit different than the one we're certainly used to in that we just talked about last week in Justice League. He's still an imposing big figure, but he's much thicker. He's sort of just built like a tank, and that I like that his personality is also reflected in the way the Lanterns use their rings very uniquely, which I think is really cool and a smart way to differentiate that. They mention at one point they're trying to figure out if they can like create a construct with their rings that can replace this broken part in their ship, and Kilowog looks at him and just says, "I make hammers." He sets up that he's a warrior, and he's very comfortable with that side of things, and I really like, I think visually speaking, I really enjoyed Kilowog maybe the most out of anything in this episode.
Well, you brought it up, so it's a fair time to talk about it now. We talked about it last week as Kilowog was introduced in the DCAU. Now, we haven't mentioned it already, I don't think, but you should know, since this is an Elseworlds episode, this, despite being a Bruce Timm executive-produced cartoon, does not take place in DCAU continuity from all that we know. However, this version of Kilowog would show up, this portrayal, this design shows up as the Kilowog that we see in Justice League versus the Fatal Five. So who knows, honestly, if there's a lot of things that say no, it doesn't, it couldn't fit based on a lot of the backstory that we know from the Green Lanterns. But again, this design was again used for Justice League versus the Fatal Five, which I believe was a Sam Liu directed project as well.
Yes, and Bruce Timm obviously also involved with that, and yeah, they reuse the Kilowog and Salak designs as well as the design of Oa, the planet there. Which is actually a pretty cool thing to talk about in itself, rather than just sort of being this generic looking planet. It has this sort of hovering energy, green energy around it that sort of, there's like two rings around each side of the planet, and then it forms into the lantern symbol on it. But yeah, despite these designs, some of these designs being used in later canon DCAU projects, as far as we know, this is not intended to be part of that universe.
Right. So this Kilowog design versus last week's Kilowog design, you have a preference?
Like I said, I really like this one. I don't dislike the other one, but I like how they made him such a tank. Like he's got like these short arms and legs, but he's all built out. And like I said, I love sort of the unique constructs and stuff that they gave him. I thought he's a really good. He's a really a lot of fun. So I think I might honestly prefer this version.
I would agree with you. Shocking, but but I think the more human form that he took in last week's episode, which again you can hear in the archives at DCAUreview.com. Check that out if you haven't. The episode that we covered, Hearts and Minds, last week, the Justice League episode, which featured Kilowog and a few other Green Lanterns. That one he has more human-esque design, standard, just broad-shouldered Bruce Timm design. This one allows his sort of alien form to he looks a little bit different than a human being. So I would agree with you. Yeah, what you also mentioned just a minute ago, Liam, the design of Oa, which I thought was certainly noteworthy. You mentioned a few other things about that. That also seemed to me to have some Star Wars DNA in it. It reminded me of the Star Wars planet Coruscant, which you can see in the prequels. If you're not a crossover Star Wars fan, then you're going to be like, what are you talking about? But they're, if you happen to be, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's a sort of this city. It was the first real like metropolis-like city design that was used. It was used in the prequels that they did in the later 90s and early 2000s. So I had some of those vibes, and that to me was a very contrasting vision of Oa than what we got in some of the Justice League and Justice League Unlimited, where it was very much just sort of like a moon-like planet with a base on it. This looks like a buzzing metropolis where people live, and tall buildings and bright lights and clouds and atmosphere. It's very, very different. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because we saw sort of bits and pieces of Oa in some of the Justice League episodes, but yeah, the idea that this is sort of like a training ground for the new Lantern recruits, as well as the sort of, it's their headquarters. A lot of them, it's their home, it's where they live. So yeah, it feels a lot more spacious and lived in than I think than OAs that we have seen in other projects go. But yeah, there's a lot of great visuals. I think the standout visual in part 1 for me, other than, there's actually a couple, but I like Hal saving the train right at the start of the episode. Just simple stuff. He just flies in front of it and makes tracks with his ring so they can glide over the part where the tracks have gone out. I thought that was clever, and then I loved the part at the end of part 1 where his battery has died, but they had established earlier in the episode that this ship they had stolen, the engine was a giant Green Lantern power battery. So as he's running away from the Red Lanterns, he sort of jumps down, lands on it, and charges his ring, and then just lets out this giant burst of energy. And it's so like, to me it was the standout, at least of part 1. It's so breathtaking and colorful and bright and everything. Like, it's so cool. It's such a great moment.
Yeah, I had that one noted as well. That whole sequence is very exciting because it's, again, they're trying to save Shire Rev, who's this injured Green Lantern, and Hal has already mentioned that his ring doesn't have a lot of juice left, and it's these Red Lanterns they've never fought before and that have their own power rings, and they're on this strange planet, and they're trying to get back to the ship, and you've already seen one Green Lantern be killed, so you don't know if these Green Lanterns are going to survive, and so yeah, the tension built up with that, and then the visuals in the midst of it were really, really great. You mentioned some of the constructs, of course, the bridge that you mentioned. To me, that was a great play on the sort of the traditional Superman scene of it's a classic superhero trope of, oh, the villain has blown up the bridge, or something has blown up the bridge, what are we gonna do? In this case, it was an earthquake, not a villain. Mm-hmm. But what's the hero gonna do? So he creates the bridge. You mentioned Kilowog's propensity to create hammers. He does that a whole lot, which I thought was great. It's kind of his go-to weapon. We had some maces. We had a part where I believe Hal is battling Razor, and he creates a bat with his ring, a baseball bat with his ring, and they sort of do more Star Wars DNA, a lightsaber-esque battle. Yes,
Razor, the young rookie Red Lantern, makes what I guess is a sword out of his red energy, and Hal, as you mentioned, has this green baseball bat, and they clash and the energy crackles, and yeah, it's very, very much a nice direct Star Wars homage there.
Then later on, another scene that was, again, had Star Wars DNA on it, as they're chasing this sort of probe, what in Star Wars terms so you would call a probe droid, but was this sort of tracking robot that the Red Lanterns had left behind. Hal and Kilowog are in the ship, and they're chasing it through this asteroid field. And he uses a drill, actually creates a drill construct with his ring to drill through one of the asteroids in order to cut this robot off on the other side. Really, really great constructs used. A lot of them. Fists, of course, fists aplenty, fists and hands. There's one part where towards the end, where Hal uses the fist construct to just sort of beat the tar out of Razor as he's kind of trapped up against a piece of the exploded planet at the end there. He just kind of pounds him into this rock. Yeah. I thought that was brutal, and it worked very effectively. Yeah, I think the constructs were fun. I thought the warp field, as they're sort of jumping their version again of hyperspace, something again that's touched on in Star Wars, sort of this, except theirs, instead of just being sort of a white blur, it's sort of this multicolor galaxy-esque colored blur. I could go probably on and on and on, because to me visuals were the most interesting part, and the ones that stood out the most. And again, because this is a different type of animation, you have a lot to look at, and a lot more. It's a lot smoother and a lot less, I think, a lot fewer errors or things that you can look at and say, ooh, that didn't look good.
Yeah, there's a few things I noticed, just more nitpicky things, but I thought, like, especially at the start of part 1, I don't know if they went back and redubbed some of the audio, but it just didn't feel like the mouth movements were matching up with what the people were saying quite perfectly. Mm-hmm. Same thing with, I think, the first scene with the Guardians. I thought there's just something there that wasn't quite matching up, and I also just thought that was the only place where I thought, like, the animation, like, maybe, I don't know if showed its age is the right, or showed its budget is the right, is maybe some of the Guardians' faces looked a little underdeveloped compared to, like, Hal and Kilowog and everyone, who generally looks very good. But yeah, I mean, that's mostly minor nitpicking things. Other than that, like I said, I think it's quite a bit of fun. And as you mentioned, part 2 is almost all action, and that ending scene where Razor, who's sort of racked with guilt over perpetuating this explosion that has killed at least some people, and Rev, this Green Lantern, he's sort of begging Hal to kill him, and Hal comes very close, as you mentioned, just pounds him, knocks him through several asteroids, but then finally, as he creates this giant drill construct, he finally kind of Hal pulls himself back from the abyss and stops himself from killing him. And even that I thought was cool, because it even shows, like, the drill slowing down and stopping, and then you can kind of see the detail in that. So yeah, I thought they very clearly went all out for especially everything involving the Green Lantern constructs and everything. And this might fall technically more under plot than visuals, but I do also just want to say, I laughed so hard at the scene where Kilowog is giving him crap for wearing a mask in space. I thought that was so funny.
That was really good. I had that notated. I didn't know whether to talk about that in voice. I didn't know if I had to talk about that in plot. But yeah, that was really, really good. I LOL'd for sure at that. That was really, really funny. Makes a lot of sense. He, giving him a hard time for wearing a mask out in space, and his reasoning for wearing it. Really, really funny. Agreed there. It's funny you just mentioned that too. It got me thinking that, where he has the drill and he's about to kind of put it through Razor. I think if they had done a better job at explaining also that the Red Lantern rage was something that kind of afforded you that red ring, it would have been an interesting way to kind of play up that, like, oh, is Hal gonna to turn, like, is he gonna turn to the dark side? If we're just gonna continue to use Star Wars metaphors around this, but is he gonna turn to the dark side here and succumb to his rage and kill Razor over this whole thing that happened? And then ends up relenting at the end because he's better than that. That could have been an interesting plot point that they played up to, but anyway, I digress. I think this is the last Star Wars visual note that I had down, but when they introduce Atrocitus also as the villain, the first time you see him, there's a scene where they're in his ship that's sort of floating through space, and it's a very Star Wars-esque scene where you're sitting there in space, and then all of a sudden, out of one of the corners, the ship comes and flies over the screen, and you get the rumbling of the ship through space. And even I felt like, and we'll talk about it in a second in our voice acting, but I felt like Atrocitus was set up to be a very Darth Vader-esque looking, sounding, feeling villain for this first episode at least.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, there's definitely, like you've said, there's a lot of Star Wars baked into this, and it makes sense. I think if you're going to do this sort of epic space adventure stuff, it makes sense to pull from, some of the most famous and beloved, science fiction that's ever existed. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of cool notes like that. The only other note, and I think you may have touched on it briefly, but when the Red Lanterns are first sort of confronting this young rookie Green Lantern, Shair Rev, to sort of escape from them, he also creates a different type of drill, and just spins and creates like this giant tornado to escape them, and until Hal and Kilowog can arrive. And I was like, that's really clever. And that's also like a super unique thing. Like, I don't ever remember seeing a version where a Green Lantern like created his own tornado before. So like extra points for like coming up with a new cool thing for a Green Lantern to do. But yeah, overall, like I said, despite some minor issues with the some of the faces and stuff like that, visuals overall are still great, and especially I think towards the end of part 1 and really all of part 2. So I thought that was strong enough to give it the perfect 10 out of 10.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, I liked it just a little bit less, and maybe it's just I love traditional animation always a little bit more than I do CGI. I gave it an 8 out of 10. It's still very strong. It'll be interesting, I think, to see in the next couple of years. Obviously, this is well into and well past some of the original CGI animated shows. Like, I can't imagine going back and watching one of our childhood favorites, Reboot, at this point.
Oh yeah, I was thinking about that earlier.
Like, I can imagine based on some of my memories of that show, but going back and kind of putting that up against, you can see it from the first Toy Story to where Toy Story is now.
Oh yeah.
If you watch it, it's like, this doesn't quite hold up the way that you would hope it would have for being a great movie. So It'll be interesting in the next, 5 to 10 years if this sort of becomes like that, and it's like, oh, this is not good. But to me, like, a regular animation is sort of timeless in that way, and that you can just kind of explain it away as art for that time, whereas CGI sort of dates itself, obviously. So with that, that's why I ended up giving it just an 8 out of 10. But either way, both high scores from both of us.
Absolutely.
All right, Liam, let's talk about music, which I am happy to report, despite the fact that so many of the DCAU shows are yet to be released on proper audio, that the Green Lantern, the animated series soundtrack that has not only 1 volume, but 2 volumes from La La Land Records and Warner Music. So if you love this show and the music, are you in luck? So with that said, I was not able to properly find them before we came on the air here, but music, pretty darn good.
Yeah, as you mentioned, there's certainly an epic. They don't completely go in a knockoff Star Wars direction, but you certainly have that sort of epic, grand orchestral music accompanying most of your big action set pieces. And I guess we can talk about it since this is our first episode reviewing it. The main title sequence is accompanied by this sort of great percussion in it. It's really fun. I love the main title theme. I think that's good. That's something that I can see myself humming, and it's gonna be stuck in my head for a little bit.
Yeah, it's really, really strong. It works out really well, and it actually, unlike some of the other shows that eventually happened later on in the DCAU that we've sort of complained about, or I've complained about, I won't speak for you, but I've had sometimes taken umbrage with, but they do use the theme song later on. It comes in when he recharges his ring, as you already mentioned, the scene where he's running up to the ship and he's in a panic and he says the oath really fast and charges his ring through the ship's power battery. The theme plays immediately right before he shoots it, and during him shooting this giant beam to get rid of the Red Lanterns. But I thought that if that played there, then hopefully you have hope that it's going to come back and return for the rest of the series, which to me, if you establish that theme, your theme song, this is the triumphant theme that plays whenever you know that your superhero is about to kick some butt. Like, yes, that's what you need to do. That's what I'm used to. That's what we're used to with Batman, the animated series. It's what you're used to with Superman, the animated series. It's a good formula. Keep it rolling.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's definitely the standout piece of music. There's certainly some good ominous mood setting music when Atrocitus appears and makes his declaration that the planet must turn over the Green Lanterns or be destroyed, and all of that. And the fight scenes, like I said, are accompanied by some good up tempo fight music. But yeah, I definitely think the standout the piece of it is the opening theme, and as you mentioned, the fact that it kind of does come back and reoccur throughout the episodes is definitely a big thumbs up. And yeah, I thought it was a really solid job all around on music, as mentioned. I believe I said it, but Friedrich Weidman was the composer for both parts here, and yeah, I thought music was really solid. I gave it a 7 out of 10.
Nice. I gave it an 8 out of 10. To me, I think, and it would be interesting, hopefully down the line, we'll have the opportunity to review some more of this series. I think based on our scores so far, that may be something we end up doing in the future at some point for an Elseworlds tale or two. But I think to me, at least for this episode, it established that music played a big role, which we know was important in past shows. Obviously, we talk about it every week on the show. That's why music is one of the categories that we rank these cartoons on, is because it adds something. It always adds something. Or if it doesn't add something, in some cases, it could detract from something. Even if it's there or not there, not having it there, it plays a very pivotal role to these shows, and a good balance and a good way to a good establishment of the music is always important. This being a pilot, having the music being established, having the theme being established is something that's going to be recurring. I felt like it set for this episode had so much action in it that it needed to have some music in the background to sort of create that tension and to create the importance of what was going on. And I felt it did that very effectively, which is why I ended up giving it an 8 out of 10.
Awesome.
All right, Liam. Moving on to our final category of the day, that is going to be voice acting. We have a couple of familiar voices here. One DCAU vet, one who if you didn't recognize his voice immediately, did you even live in the 90s and early 2000s? But let's talk about this week's voice cast.
Yeah, it's a big one, and as you mentioned, quite a few familiar ones. First off, I will mention Tom Kenny, who voices both Salak and the evil spherical Red Lantern Zilius Sox, SpongeBob himself. Very notable voice, and like you said, he's pretty much playing this evil sniveling sidekick to the main villain, but I do think he does a good job in that role. We have Jason Spizak as Razor, who is, as we mentioned, this sort of young, up-and-coming Red Lantern who is sort of repeatedly being accused of having second thoughts and doubts about the Red Lantern's missions, and in the end, he sort of, as we said, sort of wants to give himself up to the Green Lantern Corps. Hopefully, he thinks to be executed, but instead, Hal and Kilowog arrest him instead. But we have a.
I thought his strongest line that he delivered came in that final moment, and he screams, "Are you too weak to take your vengeance?" He screams that. And we should mention also, it's mentioned several times. It seems like one of the mottos of the Red Lantern Corps. And again, this may be a little cute little Easter egg, but they say, "I am vengeance." It's part of their mantra that they sort of lead it. They used it in the opening scene, and then they use it. Atrocitus uses it again later on, that he is vengeance. They have a couple things after that. They don't say, "I am the Knight" and "I am Batman," obviously, but when Razor says, "Are you too weak to take your vengeance?" I thought that was a really strong, probably his strongest line of the whole episode.
Yeah, I was a little underwhelmed with a lot of his performance, but I do definitely think he's shown pretty brightly in that final scene as Hal, kind of in the midst of beating the tar out of him, also sort of teaches him a lesson about what justice is and all that, and sort of takes him into custody instead. But yes, we have several more to talk about, including Ian Abercrombie as Gantfit. We have Jennifer Hale, who of course was Giganta and Killer Frost on Justice League and Justice League Unlimited, playing Carol Ferris. We have Grey Delisle, I believe she goes by Grey Griffin now, but as Aya, the AI, who again they sort of established is, I think that's, again, I've only seen a couple episodes of the series, but I think they develop her character, and they sort of started out by Hal and Kilowog sort of taking advantage of her naivete, and it sort of builds throughout the episode where Hal keeps kind of getting her to go against her programming, and then ultimately, so I'm sure that will develop further as the series goes on.
Notably, that also, I don't know if you saw, but she also ends up playing that same character in Justice League Action. She ends up playing Aya again, and the gentleman who we'll discuss in just a second playing Hal Jordan also plays Hal Jordan. They have a neat little sort of conversation about seemingly recognizing each other yet not having any prior interaction from what I read. So very, very interesting that there's sort of a later on in another animated series there's sort of a mention to this. But continue.
Very nice. And wrapping up our voice cast, we got a couple more big names before we get to our stars here. We have Jonathan Adams as Atrocitus. I think he's really good. Again, there isn't that much asked of him for this first episode. He's more just there to be, as you mentioned, the Darth Vader voice. But he has such like a booming and imposing voice. He's done quite a bit of voice work between animation and video games. I think he does a really good job of setting up this sort of angry and scary, but still kind of ominous and secretive villain.
His voice almost reminds me, and I wouldn't be shocked if it's in his credits, or if not, then I don't know what Disney and Lucasfilm are doing. But he could be a Darth Vader sound-alike for a video game or one of their cartoon properties with the right type of voice modulation put on him, because he had, again, that was one of the other things that was like, oh, he has that deep booming sort of James Earl Jones-esque voice that reminded me of Darth Vader, and then you have everything else of the visuals that are going on with that. So yeah, I think he seems like a perfect casting for this character.
Absolutely. And then wrapping up, we have our main players for this week, our two main Green Lanterns that we follow. First of all, we have Kevin Michael Richardson as Kilowog, who again has done about a million different voice acting roles, including the Joker on The Batman. He's on Family Guy. He's done a million other voices. We've talked about him several times before, but I think he's a very solid Kilowog. We talked about how much we loved Dennis Haysbert as sort of this lovable, kind of easygoing Kilowog. But considering this version is kind of such a stark contrast, I think Kevin Michael Richardson does a really good job as the sort of more tough and gruff fighter Kilowog. Before we get to Hal Jordan, the Man of the Hour, I would be remiss not to mention playing Shair Rev, this frontier Green Lantern who we meet and subsequently see the end of, voiced by none other than Kurtwood Smith, who, as you mentioned, Cal, if you don't know his name, go look up a picture of him. And if you still don't know who it is, then I just have to assume you didn't watch any television or movies in anywhere from the mid 1980s until present day.
Yep, Red Foreman himself, Kurtwood Smith. His voice instantly recognizable. We talked about it. He's had a couple other small roles that he's played in the DCAU shows that we've covered. Instantly recognizable. I love Kurtwood Smith. I love his voice. I didn't think it quite felt like it fit the character design, at least at the start. Yeah. The character design has sort of literally a sheepish look to them. It's like a sheepish looking alien. Quite literally a sheep, not like sheepish, like afraid, like looks like a sheep, like bah, like looks like a sheep. So it didn't quite fit, but I felt like that ending part where he's very subtly talking to Razor and talking to Kilowog, where he knows he's going to sacrifice himself. Man, it was like you got somebody that can act for this role, for this very scene right here.
Yeah.
And it was really good.
Yeah, absolutely. It's yeah, he's tremendous. And like you said, yeah, maybe it doesn't fit. There's sort of this idea that the like I said, these Green Lanterns are sort of lesser trained. They don't get a lot of attention from the Guardians. So, and obviously he has a relatively young family. So yeah, I guess you could have potentially cast like a younger actor to give him more of that like upstart rookie feel to it. But yes, as you mentioned, in those final moments, he is able to convey such great emotion where he has resigned himself to what is going to happen, that he is going to give his life so that his people and that his wife and his child might live. Again, heavy subject matter for a kids cartoon, but he delivers it greatly. And that will bring us to, as we mentioned, Hal Jordan, the star of the show, being voiced by one Josh Keaton, who is another voice actor that you probably, even if you don't know the name, you've definitely heard him voice certain characters, including young Hercules in Disney's Hercules. He also voiced Spider-Man in the I'll go on record as saying, I don't know if this is controversial or not, the best Spider-Man cartoon, Spectacular Spider-Man. That 90s cartoon is not very good, but Spectacular Spider-Man is. But yes, probably my favorite Spider-Man voice actor, Josh Keaton. As Hal Jordan, as you mentioned, he does get to play the character again later on in several projects, including some of the Lego DC video games and Justice League action as well. I think he's good. Again, it's interesting. I don't know that I have like an archetypal Hal idea of like what Hal Jordan's voice should be. But while I do think that his performance is good and he pulls off that sort of cocky, arrogant guy who you still love pretty well, this doesn't necessarily like scream like, yes, this is the quintessential Hal Jordan voice.
I would agree with that, and I think this is why my score probably isn't as high as it could have been. I don't think he does a bad job. You're right. I just don't like, based on, it's very hard for me. Obviously, growing up, we talked about this. Kyle Rayner was our Green Lantern. So not having this character as an established character in the comics continuity or even the DCAU, it's like, okay, so what does this guy sound like? So you kind of have to go off of what your brain did as a child when he did make appearances. And because he always had the gray temples, at least in the mid 90s, or before when he was Parallax, and then in subsequent appearances or pre-0 hour appearances, it was very, very, like, I imagine he was a little bit older, like late 40s or early 40s, mid 40s, which maybe like a Brad Pitt, like kind of gravelly George Clooney-ish type voice, not like young hip teenager, like
yeah, and
early 20s guy.
Yeah, I would say, and I think that's almost maybe another one of the reasons of the many that the Green Lantern live action movie didn't click for people, is that I never felt that was like a Ryan Reynolds role,
Right.
Especially comparing it to his other superhero alter ego, which it seems like he was born to play.
Right.
Yeah, the idea of him being like this, I understand, like he's a brash Air Force pilot and he plays by his own rules, like you said. We've got sort of the classic tropes thrown in, and him being this young, kind of brash, cocky Air Force pilot. It's still just, like I said, I don't think there's anything wrong with Josh Keaton's performance, but it just doesn't. It's not something like when you hear, since it's Green Lantern month, when you hear Phil Lamar voicing Jon Stewart, and you're like, yep, that's it. That's right. What that character should sound like. Or obviously when we talk about, Susan Eisenberg as Wonder Woman or something like that, where you hear it and you're like, yep, they got it, pitch perfect. And this one, like I said, not bad at all, but not exact. I don't know. Like I said, I just feel like it's missing a little bit of something. That being said, I still thought everyone was very strong in the cast, and I still gave it a pretty strong score of 8 out of 10.
I gave it the exact same score for that reason. Again, it just comes down to Hal. And again, he isn't bad. It's not a bad casting. It's just it's hard for me to rectify that this guy is like a 20-some-year-old superhero. It just doesn't. Hal Jordan is the older, like, about to pass the baton to Kyle, or like become Parallax in my always forever in my brain. It's just what I'm trained to do. So yeah, that's still very strong scores though, based on our both of us, what we gave it. Both ended up giving it an 8 out of 10. Absolutely. All right, Liam. Let's total these scores up and get the heck out of here. We end up totaling up all of my scores. 8s across the board. Crazy 8s, everybody. 32 out of 40.
And despite me not having crazy 8s across the board, I came to a final score of, wouldn't you know it, 32 out of 40.
Well, that is a shocker. So, rewatchability, Liam.
So yeah, I think obviously it makes sense. These are the first episodes. Now, because it's not an origin tale, it doesn't really fit the category of like, this is a Green Lantern 101 thing to show a non-fan. Like we said, if it's for your kids, they may not need that. So then I would say it is worth watching with the family maybe, but if you're maybe showing this to another adult, perhaps a significant other, maybe this wouldn't be where I would start as far as introducing someone to Green Lantern that isn't super familiar with it. That being said, if you just want to watch episodes of this series, I do think it makes sense to start this, because we do sort of see the genesis of this Red Lantern, Green Lantern rivalry that will sort of permeate throughout the rest of the series.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. I'd say worth a watch. If you haven't seen it before, worth a watch. I don't think it's necessarily one that I would watch over and over and over again. But if I'm going back to revisit this series and need a refresher, or again, if you haven't watched this series at all, put on the DC Universe app while you still can, and watch this for 44 minutes. All right, Liam. Well, that will wrap us up for this week's episode. Thank you, everybody, for checking out this week's episode. And don't forget, you can hear the entire archive, every prior episode, including our 2 prior Green Lantern Month episodes, all featured at DCAUreview.com. You can also check out our shop on there. We have some gear there. If you want to support the podcast, we don't do advertisements here. So if you want to support us, if you like what we do, you want to throw a couple bucks our way, that would be fantastic. Don't forget also, you can follow us on social media at DCAU Review, on Twitter and on Instagram. Instagram, obviously, a little more visual component. Liam runs our Twitter. He's over there talking about all things DC Comics, DCAU. A lot of exciting stuff happening these days in the DC world. So head on over there. Make sure you give us a follow. Also, subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app: Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio. We're everywhere, folks. So like us, leave a review if you have time on Apple Podcasts. That helps us out a lot. Liam, let's quickly preview what we've got coming up for our 4th and final week of Green Lantern Month.
Yeah, I can't believe it's almost over already, but we are wrapping it up next Saturday with our final review for the Green Lantern Month. And that will be, we're going back to the proper DCAU and going back to Justice League Unlimited this time. And we are featuring an episode that features quite a few different Green Lantern, nearly the entire Green Lantern Corps, in fact, that being The Return.
Oh, baby, that's a fantastic one from my recollection. Look forward to reviewing it with you, Liam. It is going to be a fantastic time. But until then, I'm Cal.
And I'm Liam.
And we will talk to you on the very next episode of the DCAU Review.
Adios.